You'll be happy to know my presentation's not about fornicating camels. That was just there to get your attention. One thing actually I think is funny about this slide is maybe thinking about who's on top and who's on the bottom. Most entrepreneurs assume that the entrepreneur's the camel on the bottom. And it's interesting because more than one investor I've spoken to said, yeah, the problem with investors is they yell when entrepreneurs try to treat them badly. So it sort of gives you a sense of perspective. Anyway, I'm going to talk today about maybe some topics that don't get talked about at these conferences normally. Not just unicorns, but Bollywood, some of the secrets that VCs don't want you to know. You're actually going to see me sitting on a gold toilet in this presentation. There we go. My presentation is Silicon Valley, that we sort of have to accept that it's not interested in Eurotech. And we have to accept that and build great companies anyhow. The interesting thing with Silicon Valley, which is sort of the center of the universe for things tech, or is perceived as the center of the universe, you have a lot of ecosystems trying to replicate the Silicon Valley model. I'm really think Silicon Valley can be a good inspiration, but I don't think we need to start trying to replicate Silicon Valley, especially until we really understand what makes the ecosystem work. I mean, for instance, I'm from Chile originally, and in Chile we have Silicon Valley in Miami, we have Silicon Beach, and it almost seems that every local tech ecosystem tries to sort of hitch its wagon to what's going on in Silicon Valley. Really interesting thing with Silicon Valley, from my perspective, is it's very much sort of an ecosystem on the edge. I mean, if you just think of the most basic premise of Silicon Valley, which is to make money, you have an ecosystem where you have more money going in every year than you have money coming out. So just think about that it's an ecosystem where it's almost like going to a casino where the probability of success is very, very small. And in fact, if you look at the whole ecosystem loses money as opposed to makes money. Obviously, within that ecosystem, you have some people who make a lot of money, and that's what keeps the ecosystem going. But ultimately, it's an ecosystem where, on average, most people are losing money. And actually, if you look at the returns, and I'm actually an attorney by training, so I don't love to think about numbers, but sometimes the numbers are really dramatic. You have this foundation in the United States called the Kauffman Foundation. The Kauffman Foundation is one of the largest foundations in the world. It's about an $8-9 billion foundation. And they had been investing part of their endowment in venture capital for about 10 years, and they realized the returns were terrible. And what they did in 2012 is they thought, well, hey, let us figure out if our returns are terrible because we're just giving our money to the wrong people, or is there more of a systemic problem with the tech ecosystem and money management and venture funds that people aren't talking about? And the results are really dramatic. So as of 2012, and these results really aren't any different today, because when you think by May 2012, you had sort of the whole Web 2.0 with Twitter and Facebook, et cetera, already doing very well. You had the one statistic that the VCs as an industry had not beaten the public markets for most of the past decade, and that the industry as a whole had only had one positive year since 1997. So let's just think about that. For 15 years, there was only 1 year that the industry made more money than it took in. 1 year out of 15. That's obviously not particularly good. The more important thing is that over the last 10 years, basically only 3% of venture capital funds represented 95% of the industry's return. So what does that mean? That means that, the only funds that made money were the funds that were in Facebook or Twitter or Uber or the mega deal. Basically, everyone else in the industry lost money. So again, I mean, think of an industry where you have 3% of the players making 95% of the returns. The other thing that actually didn't get very focused on in the finding in the Kauffman report, that didn't get really focused on, but for me was actually the most dramatic and made me think the most, was that, let's think about this. When you have an entrepreneur from Europe or from Latin America, from outside of the United States, that's able to go to Silicon Valley and raise a Series A financing, so say over $1 million, from a Silicon Valley venture capital fund, I mean, you sort of assume that that entrepreneur, that company, is well on its way to success. Well, it turns out if you look at it, actually 75% of companies that raise Series A financing from Silicon Valley funds actually end up failing. 75% of companies who raise Series A financing from Silicon Valley funds end up failing. I mean, that's really, really dramatic in terms of a failure rate, because you would think the failure rate would be much, much earlier. I actually spent a lot of time thinking about why that is, and at least my conclusion is that Silicon Valley funds, precisely because you have 95% of them, or sorry, 95% of the returns in only 3% of the funds, Silicon Valley funds are really only interested in investing in companies that are going to generate maybe a 20x, 50x, 100x multiple. And when you have the funds pushing the companies to go big or go home, you might have a company that raised money at a $10 million valuation that would be a great $50 million, $75 million, $100 million company. And suddenly, they're under tremendous pressure by their investor to be a $200 million, $500 million, billion-dollar company. And quite honestly, most companies, most entrepreneurs aren't built, don't have the skill set to grow that rapidly, and they end up failing. So, from my perspective, it isn't that 75% of the companies that receive this money need to fail. It's that the expectations of their investor and the reality of the entrepreneur and the company itself are just misaligned, because the investor is looking for that 20x, 100x return. And that's really the key when, again, my talk is, we just have to accept that Silicon Valley isn't particularly interested in Eurotech. It's because of what I just described. It's because at Silicon Valley today, especially after the Kauffman study, where it became so apparent that the Silicon Valley ecosystem is built around a few very, very, very large successes, which now often referred to as these unicorns, and even funds talk about dragons, which are investments that they make where not only unicorns generally considered a tech company that grows to an over $1 billion valuation. A dragon is often referred to as one of those unicorns which is so incredible in terms of its return that actually for the fund, that one investment can mean that the fund is guaranteed a positive return. So for instance, I was a partner in a company, Patagon, that we sold to Banco Santander in 2000. We sold the company for about $750 million. One of our investors, Chase Capital Partners, it invested $2 million. In 18 months, they made $120 million, and they were a $100 million fund. So they had made a $2 million investment. They made, 60x on the investment, and that one investment guaranteed that their fund, even if every other investment they made was a bad investment, it guaranteed at least a 20% return for their fund. So the game has become really focused on unicorns. Once you understand that, and you start understanding, the U.S., the reality that the Silicon Valley investor looks at when they look at Europe, what they're really interested in is where the next unicorn is going to come from. They're not interested where the next, 50, 100, $200 million company is going to come from. They're going to look at where the unicorns are coming from. Well, in Europe, you've had 40 unicorns to date. So 40 tech companies in Europe to date have crossed that billion-dollar threshold. That means that all of the unicorns in Europe to date are worth collectively $120 billion. $120 billion. The problem is that $120 billion sounds great, but the market cap of, say, Facebook is more than double that. So, the one giant unicorn of the United States is double all of the unicorns of Europe put together. And Uber, for instance, which it says 40 billion, I think it's actually like 60 billion now, is worth more than all of the unicorns of the UK. The UK, to give you an idea, has had 17 unicorns to date. And those 17 unicorns as a whole equal this, are actually worth a bit less than the valuation of Uber. Germany's, I think, has had 4 unicorns worth 18 billion. That's actually worth a bit less than the valuation of Airbnb. So, from a large Silicon Valley fund investor's perspective, he has the ability to find unicorns, literally in his or her backyard. And so, to go to Europe, to go to Latin America, to go to other markets, to find these unicorns is a lot of work, and it really understanding the dynamics of the business model of the Silicon Valley venture business and understanding, where sort of the unicorns are coming from really gives you a sense of the dynamics. One interesting thing is last year, I think in the last 12 or 15 months, Europe's actually created 13 additional unicorns. Company, Rocket Internet, Shazam, TransferWise, and several other companies. You've interestingly had also a phenomenon where you've had 3 unicorns from Europe actually go have down rounds and suddenly be worth less than $1 billion. And so, what's happened in Europe is happening around the world is you're having, a pretty dynamic situation in terms of valuations, et cetera. From my perspective, this whole sort of focus on the mega successes is, I'm definitely seeing that it's distorting the perspective of entrepreneurs. Rather than focused on building companies that solve consumers' problems, it's become much more, from my perspective, of a money game, where it's become a money game, and it's become much more about sort of playing that game wisely. And I think accelerators have done an amazing job, but one thing they've definitely done is, entrepreneurs now really can, pitch much better. They're much more sort of, capable of selling. I remember, when we started Patagon, entrepreneurs were really, the sort of tech wonks. And didn't have generally a ton of social skills, et cetera. And now you see a lot of entrepreneurs who are great salespeople. This slide actually, that's supposed to be pointing to the wallet, but I think a lot of entrepreneurs, rather than thinking with their heart, are suddenly thinking with their wallet, and that is not good for building companies. And I actually fell privy to that. After we sold Patagon, I got into playing a lot of venture investing. I invested in about 30 companies, started a number of companies, and looking back, this was a photo album from that time. I was way too focused on making money and not really focused on building the right kind of company. I think it's always interesting to me when I talk to entrepreneurs and companies I'm potentially going to invest in. Let's see. Maybe the slide was so good we get stuck. Oh, there we go. Okay. If you really start thinking of the dynamics of the internet for the next 5 or 10 years, and you take a snapshot of the internet today, it's very, very interesting. I mean, one very, very high level perspective that a lot of people don't sort of understand is that in terms of internet users, you have almost 50% of the internet users today. 50% are in Asia. That's pretty remarkable. In the United States and Canada, you only have 9.6% of the world's internet users. In Latin America, you have slightly more, and in Europe, you have about 18% in all of Europe. But anyway, it's very interesting to me because a lot of entrepreneurs who come to me and pitch businesses don't really seem to understand, where their region or their country is in relation to the whole sort of dynamic in terms of what's going on in the world. More interestingly, and I apologize, and I'm happy, you'll see at the end, you'll have my email address. You can send me an email if you want this slide. This slide's very, very interesting from my perspective because it shows not only sort of the number growth of internet use in these various regions. And what's very interesting is, you have Africa, who in the last 10 years has grown, over close to 7,000%. Obviously, Africa started off 10, 12 years ago with extremely low internet penetration. It's grown 7,000%. North America, which obviously is, the focus of a lot of things, has barely grown 200% in terms of internet use or penetration in the last 10 years. The interesting thing, though, is when you look at the penetration, even though Asia is 47% of the total number of internet users in the world today, you have internet penetration not even of 40%. And when you look at, say, North America, you have almost 90%. So when you start thinking, or the region I'm from, Latin America, I'm from Chile, even though we've had almost 2,000% internet growth, or said this, 2,000% internet growth, we're still only at 53% internet penetration. And so, for me, I start thinking about that and say in Latin America, we're a region of 600 million people. You have about 350 million people who are connected to the internet today. What's interesting with those people is about 150 million of them have come online in the last 3 years. So you've had 150 million people come online in the last 3 years. That's amazing. But what's even more amazing is you probably have another 150 million people who really haven't come online to date, who are going to be coming online in the next 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And so you're going to have this space of 5 years to 7 years where you have 300 million people coming online in Latin America. Once you understand sort of, those dynamics, and you understand that, probably in these regions you need to build a different kind of company that is than the typical company that's being built, say, in Silicon Valley, targeting a different kind of market, you need to start thinking about what kind of ecosystems should we be trying to build. And I always think that what we need to think about outside of the Valley is take inspiration from Bollywood. Bollywood, as some of you may know, is a film industry of India. Bollywood doesn't try to replicate Hollywood. It doesn't try to be Hollywood. It's a very, very different industry. In Bollywood, films, I don't know how many of you watch a lot of Bollywood movies, but the movies have very, very different sort of plot structures. They tend to be musicals with a lot of dance. The average Bollywood movie costs about $1.5 million to produce, as opposed to a Hollywood movie, which averages over $30 million. But Bollywood's a very, very successful industry, which takes some inspiration from Hollywood, but it's its own unique ecosystem, very, very tailored for the local market. And it's very successful. To give you an idea, Bollywood a year sells about 3 billion tickets mainly in India, but 3 billion tickets. All of Hollywood's movies sell about 1 billion tickets. Actually, Bollywood outsells Hollywood in terms of ticket sales 3-1. Hollywood beats Bollywood in terms of total revenues about 20-1. So, you know, Hollywood's much, much, much bigger on a world scale, but Bollywood is a very, very significant. It's about a $4 billion industry. And again, it's an ecosystem pretty apart and independent from the Hollywood ecosystem, even though occasionally you have, you know, crossover movies like Slumdog Millionaire, etc. So, you know, when I think about that, and I start thinking about the kinds of companies that we should, you know, be thinking about building, I really start thinking, okay, if you go back to that slide where you had, you know, sort of the internet today with 47% of users being in Asia, but only 38% internet penetration. Or you have Latin America, which has 53% internet penetration, or you have Africa, which doesn't even have 30% internet penetration. You see that, you know, there's a tremendous opportunity still in those markets. Well, but one thing you have to understand is how are those users getting onto the internet? Well, they're not getting onto the internet, you know, generally with computers. They're actually getting onto the internet generally with dumb smartphones. You know, 2 generations ago, not, you know, the new iPhone 6S, but, you know, some old, you know, Samsung or Nokia or something with a pretty, you know, slow processor. Those users also aren't nearly as affluent as the users that you would normally see in the United States. To give you an idea, the average internet user in the United States has an annual income of $50,000. The average internet user in Latin America has an average income of $10,000 a year. So it's still, that's middle class, lower middle class for Latin America, but obviously the kind of business you build for a consumer who makes $10,000 a year, and let's just say in purchasing power parity, maybe that's the equivalent of $15,000 or $18,000 in another market, is very different than the kind of business that you build for a consumer who, you know, has a $50,000 a year, you know, annual income. And same thing in Asia. In Asia, actually, the average internet user's annual income, it's hard, you know, given some of the currency conversion that goes on in China, but it's somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 a year. In Africa, it's significantly less than that. And especially when you think of the people who are coming online for the first time, and you think about, you know, the kinds of businesses that can be targeted to those consumers, it's really a tremendous opportunity. You have people who are, you know, coming online for the first time, whose needs aren't particularly well met by the current offering on the internet. To give you an idea just how dramatic that is, in Latin America, when we launched Patagon, you had 18 million. You only had 18 million people online. 15 years later, in Latin America, you have 350 million people online, and in the next 3 or 4 years, you're going to have somewhere around 500 million people online. So in less than 20 years, you've gone from 18 million people online in Latin America to 500 million people online. What's always striking to me, and it's really sort of, you know, my last word, is that we continue in Latin America and in a lot of other regions, including Europe, to build companies that are still sort of focused on that 18 million people who were online 10, 12 years ago. No, I'm finishing up. Yeah, see, talk soon. So anyway, you know, thank you very much. I encourage you all to, you know, keep in mind some of these, you know, demographic changes, and also keep in mind and understand a little bit better sort of the dynamics and the business model of the funds in Silicon Valley. I think that will really inform and shape, you know, how you think about your business and how you think about how to scale your business. As I mentioned, some of those slides I went through pretty quickly. Feel free to send me an email or to reach out to me. I'm happy to share any of this information with you all. So thank you very much.